Hello and welcome to Inside the Americas. I'm Delon D'Souza. Coming up on the show this week. Solidarity for Ukraine front and center during the State of the Union address. Joe Biden called Vladimir Putin a dictator as he closed off US airspace to Russian planes. Now, solidarity for Ukraine, as I said, was front and center during the State of the Union address on a Tuesday night. Joe Biden labeled the Russian President Vladimir Putin a dictator. He reiterated American troops will not be sent to fight in Ukraine, but warned that every inch of NATO territory would be defended. Biden also announced US airspace would be closed to Russian airplanes. He directly spoke to oligarchs too, warning their super yachts, luxury apartments and private jets would be seized. Sinead McCausland reports.
For his first State of the Union address, United States President Joe Biden rewrites his speech to focus not on the US, but on Russia. Calling Vladimir Putin a dictator, he said the Russian president must pay a price.
Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people.
Overshadowed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Biden spent his address delivering harsh words and announcing even harsher new sanctions.
We're cutting off Russia's largest banks in the international financial system. We're coming for you, ill-begotten gains. And tonight, I'm announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia and adding additional squeeze on their economy.
The announcement received a standing ovation.
He has no idea what's coming.
As Russia feels the force of the West's economic sanctions, Biden assures Americans they will not feel the effects of the penalties, saying the US will release 30 million barrels of oil from its reserves. On the House floor, Ukraine's ambassador to the US, sitting with the First Lady, met by a round of applause in a show of solidarity between DC and Kyiv.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Using his biggest platform of the year, Biden presented a more unified West as Russia continues its invasion.
We can now go across to Daniel Tannebaum, a Global Head of Sanctions at Oliver Wyman. He was also a former compliance officer with the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the US Treasury Department. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. How unprecedented is this wave of sanctions to target Russia?
I think the sanctions that we're seeing are actually with precedent. We've seen such comprehensive sanctions against governments like Iran. The unprecedentedness of the situation is we've never seen such a comprehensive set of sanctions deployed so swiftly with such multilateral force against an economy the size of Russia. That this really is without precedent when we look at the aggregate of the situation.
And in your assessment, what impact will these sanctions have?
So the existential question is always, do sanctions work? And I think the historical answer is sort of. In this instance, sanctions are only as good as what behavior you're trying to change. If this intended objective of sanctions are to force President Putin and the Russian forces out of Ukraine, these sanctions will not save Ukraine. Let us be clear about that. These sanctions are designed for a longer-term punishment of the Russian economy to ultimately see a change in behavior, but you've never seen sanctions kind of force this type of a situation back from the brink. Essentially, we brought sanctions to a gunfight.
The US, as you touched on this point, has already sanctioned Russia in the past. What's different this time around?
So the sanctions on 2014, which related to the annexation of Crimea, were relatively benign. They only focused on a handful of institutions in the defense, energy, and financial services sector, really focused on their access to Western capital and the ability to access credit. So those were very, very narrow sanctions where even the named institutions, there was still a lot that was permissible. We also saw some oligarch sanctions come in 2018, although those were implemented somewhat poorly and caused a brief destabilization of the aluminum sector as a result. In this instance, we've now seen sanctions against oligarchs, sanctions against the Russian central bank, which are extremely significant, sanctions against the financial services sector through SWIFT and other banking means. This is a much, much, much more comprehensive set of sanctions that frankly puts Russia in the same category as countries like North Korea, Iran, and Cuba.
I want to ask you about that because this is something the US president touched upon in his State of the Union address, where he spoke out to oligarchs, essentially, where he warned them that their super yachts, luxury apartments, and private jets would be seized. You have worked at the US Treasury Department. How do they go about identifying those assets?
So, I mean, in some instances, it's very well known who these vessels and aircraft belong to. And I do think, just as the U.S. Treasury and other governments around the world follow the money, they also follow physical assets, tracking the AIS of vessels to understand the movement of these yachts, tracking flight plans of vessels that are known to be owned ultimately by these oligarchs. And, within reason, I think there's a pretty good base of knowledge of who owns these assets and, frankly, where they're currently situated.
How quickly can they move their money around to dodge people like the U.S. in the U.S. Treasury?
I mean, let's be clear. Most of the oligarchs that are in range for these sanctions, the ones that were on the UK list that have come out over the last few days, they've known that they were under suspicion of being designated under programs since 2017, 2018, when we saw the last round of oligarch sanctions. Many of them have already migrated their assets to offshore havens to safeguard them, so to speak. I mean, there'll certainly be assets that will be seized, don't get me wrong. But realistically speaking, these oligarchs were well prepared for this situation. It was no secret that at some point a government was going to go after more oligarchs.
Now, Daniel, a host of tech companies have come out to help the West isolate Russia on the world stage. People in Russia can now no longer use Google or Apple Pay, and YouTube has removed Russia Today and Sputnik for users here in Europe.
From the latest iPhone to a new Apple Watch, all are now unavailable to consumers in Russia. Apple has suspended its sales in the country, as well as its payment and map services.
We're deeply concerned about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and stand with all the people who are suffering as a result of the violence.
The decision came after Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation called on Apple CEO Tim Cook to block sales in Russia and support sanctions. Tech giants like Apple, Google, and Facebook are dependent on sales and advertising, but they also pride themselves as defenders of free speech and democratic values. Facebook, YouTube, and Google had already taken action against Russian state media, limiting its reach in Europe and ability to make money from ads.
In response to the war in Ukraine, we are pausing Google monetization of Russian state-funded media across our platforms.
SpaceX CEO Elon Musk also answered the call from the Ukrainian minister. The first Starlink satellite terminals promised by the billionaire to provide internet have arrived in Kiev to be deployed across the country. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Kremlin is pressuring tech companies to take down certain content and has also restricted some access to Facebook and Twitter.
I'd like to bring in Daniel Tannebaum in once again. Daniel, one of the things which Ukraine has been calling for, but which hasn't seen happen, is to entirely kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. We've only seen a few Russian banks kicked out of the SWIFT banking system. How does it work to kick off an entire country from that messaging service?
The talk of the de-SWIFting Russia has become a very much a red herring. It's overblown pretty substantially in terms of that net impact. Because as a reminder, SWIFT is a messaging platform. It's the WhatsApp of financial services for global cross-border transactions where instructions are sent to move money. The important point to bear in mind here and why you don't have a universal ban on Russian institutions from SWIFT is SWIFT controls the majority of cross-border transactions between Russia and the West. As long as energy, for instance, is still flowing east or westbound, liquid natural gas and oil, financing still has to occur. And more often than not, that financing is occurring through SWIFT. So if you de-SWIFT all of Russia, you somewhat cut off your nose to spite your face because you won't be able to pay for the Russian energy supplies that you're still not sanctioning and keep available. If you begin to curtail the energy purchasing, then that's a different story where SWIFT becomes less relevant. But the punchline really is you want to limit as much impact on Western businesses as possible. At this moment, there's still a lot of commerce and trade that could legally occur between the West and Russia, and SWIFT is often a mechanism for financing that. So you'd end up penalizing Western businesses trying to sell their wares in because they wouldn't be able to get paid.
Daniel Tannebaum, thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.
Now, the United States is home to over 1 million Ukrainian Americans, and demonstrations have been taking place around the country to show support for Ukraine and condemn Russia's invasion. American celebrities, too, have been speaking out. Kathy Clifford reports.
Singing Ukraine's national anthem from Chicago to Atlanta and Detroit. A sea of yellow and blue flags appeared. In Washington, D.C., this crowd converged outside the White House. As across the United States, people turned out to show their support to Ukraine, to condemn Russia's invasion, and to raise awareness. The U.S. is home to some 1 million Americans of Ukrainian descent. Many here are part of that community.
Our nation is getting torn apart. Our families are hiding in bomb shelters. Ukraine needs help. We are our own culture, our identity, our people, and we need help to stay alive, to keep our country alive, our home alive as we know it.
We want the world to stand with us, so we want them to hear us. That's why we are here.
The Statue of Liberty was adorned in Ukraine's colors, and a giant flag rolled out across Times Square. New York is the U.S. city with the largest Ukrainian population, home to the neighborhood of Little Ukraine. Here, NGO Razum, meaning together in Ukrainian, is working to gather life-saving supplies, creating a corridor from the US to Ukraine to deliver them. The sounds of this traditional Ukrainian choir rang out in living rooms across the country as the iconic show Saturday Night Live paid its tribute. US pop legend Madonna spoke out on Instagram, posting a fan-made video against Putin's invasion. And US singer Lenny Kravitz, whose father was of Ukrainian descent, tweeted his support. While Hollywood couple Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds announced they would match up to $1 million in donations to help Ukrainian refugees. For its part, the New York Met Opera announced it would no longer work with artists who support Russian President Putin. A message brought to the stage itself as the cast of Don Carlos sang the Ukrainian national anthem ahead of their performance.
That's it for this edition of Inside the Americas. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.